teaching a class last night to 65 people in Korea. It's the rainy season there, and it's very hot and humid and rainy. And my translator was in Washington, D.C., where it was 105 degrees. Some of you might be living there now. And it was really humid and the power went out. So, I'm trying to talk to my Korean students. I don't speak Korean. I know how to say 감사합니다, which means thank you. That's about it. And so the climate shifts and the climate changes affect us on a myriad of levels, right? So the extreme heat causes, water crises, which causes flights from places where there's no water to places where there is water, which causes immigration, which causes crisis of overcrowding, which causes war. So we're seeing this from all over the planet. And it's one of the things that people are not taught to ask about. Like, how does the climate affect your relationship, your world? I live in California. There was a couple of years where the fires here were drastically affecting my family. And living on the edge of that trauma of, do you have to get in your car and run, certainly affects your relationships, and who are you going to save, and what are you going to do with the animals, and where are you in the world, and how have your parents been affected from natural disasters? How have your parents been affected from fires and floods and earthquakes? Something to ask people, because those are still in their body. And then the physical and emotional trauma from cancer, other debilitating illness, life-threatening illness. I just taught a course on cancer recovery and the many sexual side effects of estrogen blocking or testosterone blocking medications, and how long the effects of radiation chemotherapy actually last in your body, and the body image issues that affect your grief process and your self-esteem, and the idea of sexual identity that's affected by having any kind of debilitating illness, and particularly life-threatening illness. And it's amazing, because I've done trainings for medical doctors that had basically 15 minutes of training in how to talk to their clients about sex. I go into their offices sometimes and there's no brochure, there's nothing about sexuality after cancer. And so I know that there's some of you on this call, all in this class, who are nurses and doctors, pelvic floor therapists, and I would love to know that you have the language around integrative relationship therapy, that you can talk to people about the trauma of cancer and how it affects you sexually, how to recover your relationship. Grief and loss. I just did a talk with David Kessler. I would recommend him if you are looking for someone who's the expert in grief. And the idea of grief and loss as trauma, as an ongoing trauma experience. When we talk about, the symptoms of trauma, which many of you, I'm sure, know, the implications of the crossover of grief and loss. I'm working with a couple now who, he's an alcoholic and in denial about his drinking. So he'll travel for work and drink in the airport, and then he will be in a hotel room, and sometimes he'll have an affair in a hotel room, and sometimes he won't remember, but she'll call him in the hotel room and she'll hear somebody's voice in the background. And sometimes he'll be in a blackout. So they're in the process of grief and loss around the identity that they had in their relationship. The last trauma was he had been sober for like 60 days, and then she realized that he'd been drinking again in the airport, and she had the apprehension that he was going to cheat on her again, that maybe he would get fired from his job, that she would have to break up with him, and they have young kids. But what made it more traumatic was that they were in the process of selling their house, and they had just bought a new house. So the layer of grief and loss on top of that was, how can I grieve the loss of the vision of the future that I had of our relationship? So if I have this vision of us with this new life that I thought we were going to have together, now I have to let go of the vision that I had of our marriage improving. So trauma always has grief and loss embedded in it. It always has the grief and the understanding that you can never go back. So there's a process here of the narrative of the trauma. There was an earthquake. There was sexual abuse. There was a death of a loved one. Now we can never go back to where we were. So the narrative comes first, then the grief comes next. And the grief and the loss is about not being able to go back to the narrative that was. So first, when someone comes into a session, they tell you the narrative, they tell you the story. It usually lasts from about 5 minutes to 25 minutes is the first part of the narrative. And then is the grief. And let's say you have an hour session, the next 20 minutes is the grief and the loss, what we can no longer have, who we can no longer be, what we can no longer experience. And then the last part of the session, usually the smallest part, is trying to create a new vision. This is your job as a therapist. What is the new vision going to be going forward? How can we begin to visit a new narrative? What is the new narrative going to be? We're going to be alone in this new house. I'm going to be a single parent. We're going to have to pack up and move to a new city. We're going to have to go through the burnt remains of our home. What's the new narrative? Because there is an understanding in this turning point that you can never go back. Sometimes you'll hear in affair therapy, I wish we could go back to the way we were. But the healing really begins when people realize, if we go back to where we were, we're going to end up here. So that the grief process is really where the healing begins. So if you work in trauma, I'm a ketamine therapist and I did MDMA training with the MAPS Association. A lot of that was with people in the military. And there's a lot of vicarious trauma or secondary traumatization, just listening to the stories. Yesterday, I had a student who was telling me about her client who, and again, I'm going to tell you stories that might be difficult to hear. She had a client who was in the house when someone was murdered in her house, and murdered with an axe. I mean, it was very violent. And so just hearing that story, she, the therapist, was really traumatized. And I, as the therapist, was traumatized hearing the details of that murder. And the vicarious trauma spreads out into the families of the therapists that are telling the story. So my instinct is like, I want to go tell my husband, like, oh my God, you wouldn't believe the day I had. I don't, because I don't want to traumatize him. But then I have to tell, someone that supervises me or my therapist, or, the idea of vicarious trauma is it feels like you want to pass it on or else it's going to stay in your body. Vicarious trauma feels like someone is feeding you something poisonous that you want to get rid of, and not on purpose. The world in and of itself, it can be toxic. The world of trauma is toxicity. And secondary traumatization, some of you have worked with people in Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Pakistan, Sudan, Gaza, like the secondary traumatization of people in war is very high. People coming back from Iraq, Afghanistan, that kind of vicarious trauma feels like you have to do something with it, which is why we see a high level of substance abuse, trying to discharge it from our bodies, disclaim it from our psyche. And so asking yourself what is in your psyche or in your body that you're trying to disclaim or discharge, and how are you doing it? Or are you swallowing it? Therapists have actually a high rate of compulsive eating or drinking to try to be a bigger container to contain the trauma, or to wash it through, or to shove it back down. So being conscious of that. Somebody also told me the other day, which I hadn't thought of, is that therapists that have a lot of trauma in their sessions have a tendency to get out of sessions and yell at their kids. I don't do a lot of parenting work anymore because my kids are grown and I don't really want to work with kids. The person that told me that is a parenting expert, and they were saying that that's a form of discharge, chaotic discharge after working with trauma, and that they really are developing some interventions and skill sets for therapists to be aware of what they're taking out on their kids. No, none of us want to yell at our kids, of course, but I mean, we do occasionally, but we don't want to do it as discharge from trauma. Now, the risk of being a trauma therapist, particularly if you're working with couples, is that working with couples in general is a setup from the get-go. So you're walking into a session with a couple, and it's natural and normal to align with the victim. So we, as the rescuer, are doing what the world does, which is polarize. We are polarizing the narrative so that there's a good and a bad, a right and a wrong, a victim and a perpetrator. Just like in politics, there's a good and a bad. Just like in war, there's always a good guy and a bad guy. Every TV show, every movie, every book, the narrative is always about the conflict, and the conflict is always about someone who's causing it and someone who's being victimized by it. This narrative is getting old, right? And it's part of our human existence. It's part of being on this planet in this existence right now, in this lifetime. So we, as a human therapist, particularly in this triangulation, sometimes have repetitive experiences from our own childhood, right? If you grow up with two parents, it makes sense that there's a parallel experience from being in this triangulation. There's been lots written about it, the Oedipal complex, all of the things that a child will do to try to get attention from two people, trying to get the love from a couple who are primary to each other, who love each other, and then are trying to share or integrate a third. If you didn't grow up with two parents, there's other scenarios where we can triangulate, but this is a very common one in our society. I had a single mother for most of my life, but interestingly, I had a brother and sister, so there was some triangulation there, and there was a triangulation between my mother, my brother, and myself, or me and my sister and my mother. Or if you think about the ways that we triangulate in order to be loved and get attention, it's a really common thing in Western civilization. And the problem with doing it in therapy, triangulation is like a redo of trauma, right? This is a trauma triangle. So if a couple comes in, let's say, with an affair, it's normal to automatically assign these roles. I'm going to fix you. You're the one that was cheated on. You're the one that cheated. That lasts an average of 2 sessions. until you find that the perpetrator was actually the victim first. Most people who cheat feel abandoned or hurt prior to the affair by their partner. So you find out that the person cheated first, or there hasn't been a sexual relationship for a decade, or there's some narrative prior to this particular trauma. And so now your triangulation switches around. You see the victim as the perpetrator, but now you have damaged their collusion. So their dance of victim and perpetrator has worked for them on some level. How has this role worked for them in their relationship to contain the trauma, or to have some kind of understanding of the framework of the trauma? So when you begin to shift it around, now you become the perpetrator because, hey, don't pick on my partner. They didn't mean to do that. And I'll take the blame for being the bad guy. I'll take the blame for being the cheater so that their family can blame me, or I'll take the blame for being the cheater so that when we break up, her friends won't blame her, or whatever the narrative is. Most people come in not wanting to change their narrative. They come in wanting to feel better. They don't want to change the narrative. They don't want to change the collusion. They many times want to change their partner, and they want to change how they feel, but they don't necessarily want to change the dance. And that's important, because when we're talking particularly about trauma, we take on roles that are historically have impact on our survival. So we have to honor that the couple is colluding in a way that feels important to them. So a better question to ask is, how has this affair worked for you? How has this situation, whatever they're in, worked for you? Now, that's not something you can ask someone in the first session. You have to create that space of trust around you, the two of you, the three of you, the four of you, the five of you, so that they can begin to have some insight into the collusion of how this is beneficial to them on some level. But that's how trauma therapy works. It doesn't work where people come in, you say, oh, you're doing it this way, you should just change, and people change. And if any of you have been doing this therapy for a while, you know that the first couple sessions seem positive, and then after the third or fourth session, they come in and you say, I can't believe that they haven't listened to me. I thought we were doing so good. I thought I was being such a good therapist. Why are they doing the exact same thing they did when they first came in? Because they're like a rubber band. They'll start to stretch, they'll start to shift, and then they'll pop back to the way they were in order to survive. So that's a sign that there is trauma in the relationship, that there's a traumatic history. And so that's good information for you. So now we're still in the assessment phase. We're not in the application phase yet. Assessment is much longer than you think, much longer than you realize. So in order to be trauma informed, we have to shift that judgment of like, why are you doing that? And why aren't you listening to me? To curiosity, and ask, instead of why is that person doing that? I wonder what happened to this person. I wonder what happened to this person that they are taking on this role of being the perpetrator, or are taking on this role of being the victim in this relationship. I wonder what happened, because I did my best work trying to get them out of that. And yet they are perpetrating now against me, or now I feel like the victim, or what's happening now that we're still in this trauma triangle. That's your best form of assessment. If you continue to be in the trauma triangle, then there's trauma in the room. So the triangle can be a closed pattern of repetitive energy. It feels like it's going nowhere, right? Like, oh my God, we're going to be stuck here forever. And it needs an outside force to get out of this cycle. So it may be why someone has an affair. Like, we got to break out of this somehow. it's hopefully why people go to therapy. But keep in mind that whether the couple has a third person as an affair partner, or the couple has a third person as the therapist, it's still a trauma triangle. So it's still a parallel process. So they've just traded in the affair partner for the therapist and repeated the same trauma triangle. So, be careful that you don't, align with them in a way that puts you in the privileged position of being the therapist while the outside affair partner is the perpetrator that's ruining their relationship. We sometimes put ourselves in that privileged space because, we're the know-it-all therapists, and somehow we're going to save everybody. It may just be a recapitulation of the problem. So now we need some kind of outside force to heal them from the trauma. I really believe that that's why psychedelic therapy is so powerful right now, like ketamine therapy. They're looking at MDMA this month. It's been through phase 3 trials, and they're looking at whether or not it's going to be legal or not. And then psilocybin will come right after that. I believe that it's because it takes the authority away from us and gives it back to the client. So it's saying that the client has their own inner wisdom. They know what they need to heal. They have their own inner healer, and they know what they need to do to work on their relationship or to heal their trauma. We are there as guides, and we are there to hold that space for them so that they can find their way out of it. It takes them out of that triangulation of looking for the person that's going to rescue them. They find their own rescue. They realize that they can rescue themselves through their own inner psyche. And it certainly saves a lot of time. I'm not saying that it's for everyone, but I find it fascinating that we have come to this place in history where we are giving the power back to the client and their own internal experience and their own inner wisdom. And it doesn't mean that we are not valuable as guides and as people who can help the trauma survivor integrate the experience, because the medicine in and of itself, or the drug in and of itself, is not the key. It's not like you can just go home and do your psychedelic experience and be healed. The key is in the integration of the experience, hence integrative therapy. You have to be able to integrate what comes up for you and understand what it means. So, MDMA therapy, ketamine therapy, psilocybin therapy, you have to have sessions after the experience to talk about what happened and what came up in order to understand the meaning of it. So I'll give you an example. I had a client who had gone through ketamine therapy. I didn't do the ketamine with them. They went to someone else to do the ketamine, and I did the integration sessions with them. They had been through a terrible car accident. The trauma had destroyed most of their lower body. They had smashed their pelvis and crushed their knees, and they were in a wheelchair and hopefully will be eventually in a walker. But they were having terrible trauma symptoms and a lot of physical pain. And they went to, I think, 2 ketamine sessions where you take ketamine. It's depending on the dose, it can be very psychedelic or psycholytic. Psycholytic is a lower dose where you can talk about the experience. Psychedelic is you go deeper into a very visual and sort of a physical experience, and then you come back out. It's very short. It's like 40 minutes to an hour. And she came about a week later to tell me that her psychedelic experience with the ketamine was very physical, but also very visual. And she saw herself as a fish. she felt like she was swimming in the ocean, and she could feel almost like a dolphin. She could feel her body um, flying through the waves. And what she said was that she could feel her spine moving with her hips and her legs. And she said, I feel like they misdiagnosed my injury, that this is about my spinal cord. It's not just about my hips and my knees, that there is a part of my spine that has disconnected from my lower body. And I can I can heal my spine. I know what my spine needs to heal. And it's not sitting in a chair. I need some kind of movement. And so we actually talked to her surgeon and we talked to her physical therapist. She's in physical therapy. And her physical therapist said, I don't know if you should move. I mean, that kind of movement can cause severe pain. And she met with the doctor, and the doctor said, look, if you want to try it, we can do this certain lower back movement with medication. And now she's doing it. And I don't know if it's going to work. Nobody knows. But she was called to her own body, to her own healing, to her own experience. And I hear that all the time, like the call to inner healing. I had another client who she realized that through her ketamine, that she had always been treated as an outsider in her family, that she was a therapist, and that her parents used to leave her home alone a lot. She was an only child, and she didn't have a connection with a grandmother or a grandfather or cousins. And they always treated her as if, they would joke around saying, you must be adopted. I mean, you're so different than us, and you're so alien to us. And she, in her ketamine experience, had a vision of herself being an alien from another planet. And then she realized, I separated myself from my family and made myself alien with a different color skin in her mind. She used to imagine she was green. She was from a family from Nigeria. And she said, I used to imagine my skin was green. And now I realized from the ketamine that I did that because I didn't want to be part of the family. It's not that they treated me like I was different and therefore I felt different. I didn't want to be part of that family because I felt that they were dangerous. And it was my way of having other people outside the family recognize that I didn't belong to them, so that they would come and rescue me. They would come and rescue me and take me back to where I belonged. And it was just so human and heartbreaking. And so we talked in the therapy to integration about what it meant to be human and what it meant to be rescued, and what it meant to rescue herself. And part of her trauma symptoms were about needing to be rescued in situations, and how she would show people in relationships, but she wouldn't tell people what she needed. She would show people, I need you to do this. I need you to act this way. I need you to make me feel. I need you to have sex with me in this way. I need you to say you're sorry. But she wouldn't tell people what she needed. So she was trying to show them, and she was trying to get rescued. And the last part of that is that she started wearing bright lime green clothes to honor that little girl in her who was trying to be rescued and trying not to fit in, and also just to honor that she did belong on Earth. And we're still working around that, what that means. It's very sweet. So the trauma symptom for her was also that she had this emotion that appeared sometimes out of context. Like she would get very angry if like something would fall. What happened to her? Oh, something fell off the shelf at a CVS or maybe I shouldn't say the brand name, at a drugstore, and nobody came to help her to put it back on the shelf. Nobody noticed that she needed help. And she stood in the aisle of the store and just sobbed. And she couldn't understand what was happening. She was angry. She was hurt. She felt really helpless, like helpless with the small challenge of putting this toilet paper back on the shelf. And so that kind of trigger where the emotions feel really out of context is a sign that something's connected to the past, right? We know this from our trauma work. Bessel van der Kolk talks about how, the intense reaction to something minor is stored in our body, how our behaviors don't match our history. We can freeze when we're frustrated. I have a trauma response. When my husband was in the hospital, I noticed that an old trauma response, I sat in front of the TV and ate candy. It was around Easter time, so the Peeps were out, and I love a good Peep. Peeps were especially good this year. But all I did was eat sugar. And people were calling me saying, can I bring you dinner? Do you want to go for a walk? Is there anything I could do to help you? And I wasn't answering their phone calls. I didn't want them to bring me anything. I didn't want to see anybody. I just wanted to watch terrible TV. And I realized that when I was young, I was very abandoned as a kid, very neglected. I grew up in a really difficult home. My mother worked 3 jobs. We traveled a lot. I lived in like 15 homes before I was 10. We lived on the road. My parents were together till I was about 7. And, we lived definitely like gypsies. And I remember that's how I survived. Like I just sat in front of the TV when we did have a TV, and nobody made me dinner because nobody was home, and I just fed myself candy. I mean, what else would you feed yourself if you were a little kid alone? And I just felt like, oh my God, I've regressed to that response, that freeze response, because I had this life-threatening terror that my husband could die. This must have been how I felt as a kid, a life-threatening, intense trauma feeling of survival. So, amazingly, we will develop a survival skill because we as little humans are very resilient, right? We will find ways to survive. I just read a memoir recently about a young child who grew up in the turn of the century in England, really, really in poverty and just basically like a wild child on the streets, and what she had to eat and what she had to find at like 6 years old, and how we will develop relationships even with people that are abusive because we need to survive. And part of that is affecting how our brains develop. So it's called emotional regulation resiliency. Our brains will develop even if we're traumatized, and even if we don't feel safe, even if we don't attach to someone who's safe for us, even if we don't have safe attachment figures to care for us. If we begin to create relationships with anyone, with a neighbor, with a grandparent, with the guy from the grocery store, we will begin to develop healthier attachment. We will begin to develop more resiliency. I survived my childhood and became a very independent person. I can take care of myself, and I could take care of my kids. And I became an entrepreneur who could run her own business. I'm very, very good at it. It's also my downfall. I've been, accused of being sort of the lone wolf many times, but it's also the thing that helped me be successful in life. So the emotional resiliency that you develop as a result, oh, thanks for that little heart. That was sweet. It's also the emotional resiliency that you develop as a survival skill. We'll talk about that a little bit more this afternoon when we talk about what your benefit is. Like, oh, more hearts, thank you. It's amazing the emotional response you need when you talk about something vulnerable. So what happens in your brain when you're reminded of trauma? So talking about your trauma, like the difficulty with language, like you might start to lose the capacity to say words. Like I can feel myself getting choked up when I talked about those hearts. Decreased inhibition of emotions. Like you might try not to cry, but you can't help yourself. You might not be able to express yourself in the way that you would like to. You might stop being an intelligent person altogether. Your prefrontal cortex is the part of you that is like the grown-up part of your brain, right? Your brainstem is the fight or flight. So if you're reminded of your trauma, the blood flow increases to your amygdala and the emotions are activated. So you're not speaking from your prefrontal cortex. Now, many of you on this call might be trauma experts, so this might be a do-over for you. Some of you are new to this. What I noticed in this field is that there are so many trauma courses right now. You can learn about trauma from a lot of people from a lot of different areas, from the polyvagal area to learning about it through yoga. So I want to encourage you to take them all if that's your interest, because we need all of this. So take what you can absorb from this, and if it feels new, learn more. If it feels like a repeat, become an expert. Let yourself really absorb that, like, oh, I think I know that, and I think I can use that. Then honor that in yourself. Like, pat yourself on the back, because this is a relatively new science. So good for you if you've come this far. Now apply it to yourself. Now apply it to yourself. And now apply it to maybe teaching it to others or expanding it to a different population. If say you're using it for individuals, start using it for couples. Say you're using it for couples, start using it for couples in sex therapy. And notice that you can function at a higher level in this capacity than you think you can. You can function at a higher level than you think you can. What does separate us from animals is that we have a capacity for choice. So we are not just reactors. We are not just, oh my God, you said something that upset me, so I have to say it and I can't hold back and I'm going to cancel you and I'm going to, tell everyone on the social media that, you said something that I disagreed with. Like, that's a reaction. That's happening a lot today in this field because trauma is triggering for people. Trauma triggers people's trauma. Talking about trauma can be traumatizing. But we don't have to get reactive about our trauma because we have flexibility and a capacity for choice. And I want to reassure you, because a lot of people get burnt out working from trauma for just that reason. I supervise somebody who works with a lot of sexual abuse and sexual assault and perpetrators that have been put in jail. And they said, the kickback that they get, not from the perpetrators, but from other therapists because they work with the perpetrators, is really astounding to them. And they can't take it. It's burning them out. The other therapists are like, how can you work with them? What's wrong with you? Those people are horrible. And she said, it's not my job to educate people to say, look, if we're going to stop sexual assault and sexual abuse, we can't just work with the victims. We have to work with the people that are doing it and understand why. And not everyone's meant to do that. It's not an easy job. But it's so interesting how people have that brainstem response because it's triggering our trauma. Like, oh my God, I don't want to work with those people. Those people scare me. I wouldn't know what to do. I'd be afraid of them. I'm afraid for you. I'm worried for you that you're going to be hurt. And so instead, they get reactive. But we have a capacity to be flexible and adjust in the moment. And the key is to go from reactivity to curiosity. Like, wow, how do you do that? How do you take care of yourself? What's that like for you? I'm so amazed that, you have the resilience and the flexibility to to hold a space for people like that? Like, or people who do that, not people like that, excuse me. How do you manage that in your life? And so to hold that curiosity. And because our behavior is more complex than just an instinct or conditioned behavior. Like, people are not abusers. People are people who abuse. People are not bank robbers. There are people who rob banks. And so we have a neocortex that integrates a large amount of information that we attach a meaning to, right? So the incoming input, it sends an urge or a tendency. So we get a large amount of information coming in. I'm in the city, I'm walking through the streets, there's a whole bunch of stimulation, and then somebody's walking towards me, and my body will have a physical urge or a tendency to walk away from that, right? So the information that is perceived through my brain sends the physical urge. So, and then we apply logical thought to calculate what will happen if I cross the street, or what will happen if I keep walking towards that person. And then we find new ways to modify our responses. Next time someone's walking towards me that I feel there's some kind of information coming that my body responds to, then I'll calculate what to do. And then I'll remember from last time, because now that's in my brain, and I'll find a new way to deal with it. Your brain will continue to learn new complex ways of dealing with things. If you've been traumatized many times by that person coming towards you, and every time they come towards you, they hit you over the head with a stick, you have a couple different choices. You can continue to walk towards them and get hit over the head with a stick, because sometimes trauma freezes your response. Or you can hit them back, or you can not refuse to go down that street, or you can hide when everybody comes towards you. So we condition ourselves to respond to certain things, but we also learn. And that's what the goal of therapy is. Like, how can we learn different responses? Now, when we get triggered, that higher nervous system, those higher choices don't function. So our lower nervous system, our fight or flight, our survival system functions. I'm going to go at that person with a stick. I forgot what we talked about in therapy. Or I'm going to run and hide behind this garbage can in the alley because I forgot what we talked about in therapy. I forgot that I can go across the street. I forgot that I have choices. I forgot that I'm making up that there's a person coming towards me at all, and that it's a shadow. I have to align with, I have to align and integrate the information. So that flexibility emerges slowly in therapy, just like it emerges slowly in childhood. So children need help with their reactivity. So they need to learn how to modulate their autonomic arousal. So in other words, we mature and we develop autonomy as our prefrontal cortex develops. So they need help in the grocery store when they're stamping their feet saying, I want it now. They need to learn that they are going to get it later. That's not how they react. Just like we need to learn, I want it now. We can't scream and yell as adults either, even though sometimes we do yell at our partners that way. I want it now. How come you're not giving it to me now? So we're in therapy and we have to relearn how to modulate our arousal system. Our arousal system is triggered by something. And for whatever reason, we have not developed that flexibility to remember, to reintegrate the system that tells us that we are reacting in a way that's not using our prefrontal cortex. It's very hard. When my husband pisses me off, I like react. There's nobody in the world that can trigger me like my husband, right? He probably doesn't trigger you in the same way. I watch other people react to him. I'm like, doesn't that piss you off that he just said that? And they're like, no, it's fine. You know, we're in the kitchen and he's telling me how to cut onions and I'm like losing it on him. And I see other people in the kitchen with him, and he says, you should cut the onion this way. And they're like, oh, okay, that's a good idea. I'm like, I can't believe that you were okay with that. I am triggered by somebody telling me what to do because I grew up not having anyone telling me what to do. And I needed to know how to do it my way. And I needed to be independent in order to survive. So now when somebody tells me what to do, especially in a really bossy way, I get incredibly triggered, right? I get like this overwhelming, like, do not tell me what to do. I will do it my way because I need to do it my way in order to survive. So, but I don't think that in the moment, I just yell at him. So, that new system is still coming online. We've been together for a long time too. And I'm only admitting this to you 16,000 people. So the goal here, Piaget used to talk about, is decentration, which is the having your emotions, not being them. So not being a bitch, but being angry occasionally. Like, I'm sorry, I just swore, but not being reactive all the time and being defensive, but being able to experience the emotion, understand it, and choose whether or not to react, to feel that frustration in the kitchen and to choose, am I going to get mad at him for saying this? Or am I just going to roll my eyes and make a joke about it? Am I going to say, well, you cut the onions then? It's not that important. Or am I going to say, it's not that important, I'll just do it his way? Like, how am I going to choose? Because I have the emotions, they don't have to decide for me how to be in relationship. So because I have the emotion, they don't have to decide for me how to be in relationship. Obviously, that's harder for kids. It's easier for mature adults. It's harder for people who've had a trauma response that has become very rigid in their brain. It's not that I'm not grown up. It's not that I'm acting as a little kid. It's that there is still that little part of me that has become very rigid because that was replayed over and over and over in order to survive. It was a life-threatening experience. Therefore, it was a survival skill. Therefore, it's much more integrated into who I am as a person. So changing that can feel life-threatening, which is why when you have that couple that comes in, changing that triangulation can feel life-threatening. It's not like, oh, let's just shift this around and let's not blame your partner. People can cheat. No, it feels life-threatening to get out of those roles. So action tendency means that when we feel those stimulating emotions, it triggers a physical action. So the function of emotions is to take action. We learn to identify what action is associated with what emotion. So there's an arousal cycle of emotion, right? Like when you feel tender or love, or when you look at a baby, the tendency physically is to go towards them, is to hug, is to hold their cheeks, is to be affectionate. That's the action tendency. And there's a reason for that. It's built in as a caretaking system. There's also an arousal cycle of anger. You get triggered, you escalate, there can be a crisis of emotion, but then there's a recovery, and sometimes there's like depression afterwards. So if you've ever worked with veterans or people who have rage, there's a cycle of rage. There's a trigger, it escalates, there's a crisis, and then there's a recovery, and there's usually remorse and then depression. So the feeling that's in your body gives you the tendency to do something. Now, sometimes people are frozen around those emotions. Sometimes people never experienced caretaking or attachment. So when they feel those feelings, they don't go towards you, they don't attach, they don't hug. Sometimes when people experienced anger, they went right into crisis and they got physical. So action tendency means that emotion is triggered into something in your that moves into your body. Barack Obama actually said this, which I thought was interesting. There's still a reptilian side of our brain that leads people to not trust others if someone sounds different or looks different. So that action tendency, when you feel an emotion, is triggered differently when someone looks different than you do. So going back to this little girl who pictured herself as looking different than her family, she didn't trust them. And so in her mind, they became people that looked different than her. But basically, this quote is about we automatically align with people who look like us. And this has to do with racism and the division that we feel in this polarization in our world today. You know, there's us and them, there's me and you, there's the Democrats and the Republicans, there's terrorism. There's this idea that there's always an other, and usually that other looks different. And that can sometimes lead to what we call false prediction. So it's the projection of what we think is going to come. And then when we think that's what's going to come, then we activate physically. So I'll give you an example of right after 9/11. I was living in Connecticut at the time, and I was treating, Connecticut's kind of a bedroom community for people that commute into New York City. It's halfway between New York and Boston. So the lower half of Connecticut is New York, and the New Haven and up is really Boston. So I was seeing people that were commuting into New York during 9/11, and afterwards there was just so much trauma. And I was working with people who, were starting to fly again, and they would see Muslims get on airplanes and have a physical response. Like the racism that was in the airports was dramatic. And they would react physically. Like some people were getting off planes, people were getting nauseous. They were bullying people. So it's a false prediction of like something bad's going to happen if someone that looks like that or doesn't look like me gets on a plane. We form images through our vision or our touch. And when our internal and external experience match up, then we can start moving. Moving is the opposite of rigidity. When we feel traumatized, we stop moving. So if everyone on the plane looks like me, I can relax. I can stop freaking out. There was another person I worked with. She was a gymnast, and she was sexually abused by her coach. And when she would get on a bus to go to a meet, if it was all girls on the bus, then she could fall asleep and take a nap because they would leave at 5 o'clock in the morning to go on these weekend jaunts and all day meets. But if there was any men on the bus, it didn't matter if it was a coach or they had these sort of guides that would go with them because they were going to different states. She would sit up all day on the bus. She wouldn't sleep. She wouldn't eat. She would get sick by the time they got there. So her internal and external experience had to align for her to feel like she was in this zone of safety. So trauma means we're responding to past feelings or triggers or reminders, and we automatically act in ways that do not fit in the present. So her abuse by her coach had been a couple years before, but if a coach got on the bus, she acted as if that had happened yesterday. And so I know for you as therapists, that does make sense. We're going to take questions in a couple minutes, but let me just get through a couple other slides. I see there's a bunch of comments. So boundary violations, most trauma happens in interpersonal relationships. Most trauma. I know we've talked about climate trauma and things like terrorism, like 9/11, but the trauma in and of itself is a boundary violation. I mean, that's certainly a boundary violation. But the trauma that we're going to talk about for the rest of today and most of tomorrow is about interpersonal relationships and how do we help people heal. You know, we lose the ability to choose our autonomous actions, and we can't self-regulate if there's been a boundary violation. So for her, being on the bus, losing the ability to relax and to take a nap, and to just self-regulate, like to be able to self-soothe, she couldn't do it because of that boundary violation that happened in such a close personal relationship. And it happened to a lot of girls in gymnastics, by the way. So chronic independence, I mean, I'm a poster child. The amygdala forms this fear response. So it controls your autonomic nervous system, and freezing or creating a sense of immobility. Immobilization becomes habitual. So we develop chronic independence. So that feeling of being immobile, sitting on the couch, I can't move, I can't get up, I can't go out, I can't get up and make myself healthy food. It's a freeze response. And it's also, I don't need anything from anybody. I'm not going to ask anybody for help. That chronic independence is actually a survival skill that comes from a boundary violation. It could be chronic neglect, it could be chronic abuse, it could be one-time abuse. Okay, so before we define what is actually the difference between trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, let's take some questions. Ryan, do you mind?
Absolutely, happy to do it. Just making sure, am I coming through okay? Can you hear me? You see me?
Fine, perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, I've got a number of them so far. I'm going to filter by the most upvoted. Originally posted by Ruth Ann, and it was asking earlier, she was asking from earlier, can you give additional examples of how trauma triangulation might work with other relational dynamics besides an affair?
Yeah. So I personally think whenever you do couples therapy, it works in every dynamic, right? So someone comes in and says, you know, can you just fix my partner and then we'll be fine. So there's usually a dragger and a draggee, and there's usually somebody who feels like you need the therapy, someone else who's maybe willing to come, but not as excited about it. And the narrative is usually, let me tell you what this person has done wrong or how we're not working. And the underlying story is because this person is doing too much of, or never does, or always does. So it's very clear from the get-go who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, like who feels victimized and who will readily identify who's the perpetrator. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't switch back and forth, because the narration is always, you did this to me, you did that to me. The important piece for us as therapists is to not align with one or the other as they are in their victim mode, and also to not align as a rescuer. And the way to do that is to never put ourselves in that superior position. And that's hard because we've been trained to put ourselves in the superior position. I've been in, you know, I've taken a bazillion courses, I've been bazillion certifications, I have letters after my name. Of course, I'm the expert in the room. However, if I put myself in that privileged, superior place that, you know, Western medicine has given us, you know, like I have all the answers, they're in the bottom of my desk, I will only pull them out after you pay for a certain amount of sessions, then it takes the power away from the couple themselves. And every couple is different, every client is different. Only they really have the answer to what they need. So we have to put the power back on them and their inner wisdom to find out what will actually be healing for them. So in the rest of this course is 2 days of the integrative relationship therapy course. I talk again about how to give them back their inner wisdom, but that's like a short answer to a much longer intervention. But thank you for that.
Thank you, Ruthann. Next question, originally posted by Laura. How does polyamory, ethical non-monogamy fit into the idea of trauma triangle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even if you see, like I work with people who are in open monogamy agreements, and sometimes I'll see people who are like 3 or 4 or 6 people at a time who are in relationship with each other. And so there's a lot of trauma triangles within that bigger pod. And what I see there is not so much a projection of the parental roles, but the sibling roles. So it's like they are all navigating and negotiating the sibling experiences that they've each had coming from different parents. So, how come they get Tuesday nights and I only get Wednesdays? Or how come they're sleeping in the better room? Or how come they get to go out for coffee with so-and-so and I didn't get to have coffee with them? How come they get the bike and I didn't get a bike for Christmas? It's like all sibling stuff. So you still see the triangulation, but there's more of them. So it's just more complicated.
Thank you. Next question is from Jessica. Can you speak on trauma dumping when people turn around and share the vicarious secondary trauma stories with people in their life?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I may have done a little bit on that on you guys dumping my story, but there's a difference between sharing your stories as it's relevant and dumping your stories. A lot of therapists do dump on their spouses, like, oh my God, you wouldn't believe my day. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital where I worked with dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality and severely sexually abused clients, people that had been abused in cults and satanic cults, like really traumatic experiences. And I desperately needed to dump that stuff on somebody. And I couldn't dump it on my partner at the time. But the problem was there was no place to dump it. I had one supervisor group at work that met every 2 weeks in a group. And so that was the only place I had to dump it. I had to get therapy to be able to have a space to talk about it. And I started having symptoms in my body and nightmares. And the idea of trauma dumping is very natural and normal because, again, we're trying to, shed the snake out of our body so that it passes through. The desire to have that stuff pass through us is actually a sign of health. Like we want to have a sign of health. I think the question is really, what do you do when someone is dumping on you? So it's not so much, how do you not trauma dump on somebody? The question is more, what do you do when someone's trauma dumping on you? Mm-hmm. If you're a therapist, I mean, that's kind of your job to take their trauma. But if you're a friend or a partner and someone's doing it, it's really important to understand what your own boundaries are. What I find is that if you've been through a lot of trauma, you are more likely to take other people's trauma on. You're also more likely to watch horror movies or like detective shows where people get hurt and killed or kidnapped. Or I find that fascinating. I don't quite have a handle on what that's about, but it's like we are re-experiencing it on purpose, trying to have control over the experience, because I'm deciding what I'm going to watch. I'm deciding when I'm going to watch it. I'm deciding if I can turn it on or off. I'm not trying to have control over it.
Mhm.
So I would just encourage you to have control over what's coming into your system and know that it is coming in, that sometimes it could be overwhelming and you have the right to turn it off or turn it down.
That's fascinating. I've also, Jessica didn't mention specifically what perspective, but I am kind of curious in terms of like with clients' experience of trauma dumping. Do you have any guidance or as that you offer to your clients as far as how much they should, shouldn't, what that looks like?
Meaning, if the client is on the therapist, what we should tell the client.
So I think you spoke a lot to therapist perspective of trauma dumping, but as far as is the clients dumping on people outside of therapy, being dumped on, kind of that experience. What's it like for them?
So, what's it like for our clients when people are dumping on them? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think, learning our own boundaries and our limits and our capacity to say, I don't want to hear this, is part of healthy boundaries. So, what you're teaching people is how to set boundaries with other people. Um, I'll give you an example. I have a client who was staying with her brother who was watching CIS, that show about
Yeah.
sexual
Yes.
violence every
Mm-hmm.
week, some sexually violent thing happening. He would keep the TV on in the kitchen
Mm-hmm.
cooking. And she was like, she wasn't saying anything. And part of the therapy was learning to have boundaries with her brother and say, I can't listen to this. So he wasn't trauma dumping on her, but the TV was trauma dumping on, and he knew that she had been through her own violent history. So, I mean, it's really having the courage and the strength to say, I can't watch this, or leaving the
Mm-hmm.
room if he wants to watch it, but I can't be in the room with you.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's helpful. Appreciate that. Next question is from Terrence. I'd like to know more about how to distinguish abusive relationships from regular conflict and how to avoid colluding with the abuser by staying neutral
Um, okay, so recognizing abusive relationships.
from regular conflict. Distinguishing the abusive relationships from regular conflict. We'll start there.
Yeah, I mean, if you've been in an abusive relationship, it's actually harder to distinguish that from regular conflict. So if you've had abuse in your past, you might normalize
Hmm.
abusive behavior instead of calling people out on it. Um, really being aware of an abusive cycle, that what gaslighting is. There's some background noise. I think it's you. Yeah. Some what gaslighting means, uh, what it means to be in an abusive cycle where somebody is abusive, then they deny it, then they blame you, which is the gaslighting part, when they tell you you're crazy for feeling that way. And then it increases, and then they apologize, and then they get remorseful, and then they say they'll never do it again. And then there's a time of real kindness and gift giving or sexual connection and real intimacy, and then it starts again. So recognizing the cycle, being able to point out to your clients or to your partner or whoever, this is abuse. This is not just regular conflict. We keep ending up here over and over again, or you keep ending up here over and over again, or being sensitive to the way that somebody talks to another person. I'm trying to think of an example. I have one couple that, and this is so controversial, but he tells her that he's not attracted to her anymore. And there's a difference between saying, I feel like our relationship has really lost a lot of its juice and we're not feeling as much desire for each other, versus you've gained a lot of weight and gotten really fat, and I'm just not hot for you anymore. One is taking responsibility for the relationship together and perhaps being curious about it. And the other one's just being mean. And so, really not tolerating being mean or being rude. That's really the first line of defense, I think, against abuse.
Appreciate that. Do you ask both partners how the dynamic is benefiting them when there is clear abuse?
That's a complicated question because it depends on the kind of abuse. If we're talking about trauma and we're talking about, reliving a trauma cycle. So, like I have a couple who, one of them was in a sexually abusive relationship in their early teens. Now, as an adult, they'll sort of act out in adulthood some of the things that she did as a teen, and then she will feel really bad about it. She'll go into shame and sort of a shame spiral and withdraw, and then they'll get intimate again. He'll promise to never make her do it again, and then he'll sort of manipulate her into doing this particular sexual act again, and then she goes into the shame spiral. Like, it's a real sort of abusive cycle. I would point out to both of them the repetitiveness of the cycle, and ask how it's working for both of them. My common experience is that it's not that the abuse is working, it's that the remorse cycle works in abusive relationships. So it's the time when they both feel really intimate. She goes into her shame spiral. He tries to make it up to her. He feels really bad. There's a time where they don't have sex. He says, "I'm sorry. I love you. I'll never do it again." That's what she needed back then by her abuser. So they keep recreating the same scenario so she can get what she didn't get back then. And so she's trying to heal from her old experience, but it's not working because it's not from the right person. So, but it's a way for your brain to try to take control of an experience that you didn't have control of back then. It's like a lot of people who had sexual assault experiences will sometimes have sexual fantasies of being assaulted because your brain is trying to take control and have a pleasurable experience in your imagination so that you can be in charge of what happened. I'll decide who does what to who, when it happens, how it ends, that when I say no, or if I say no, and how it's going to go this time. Your brain is an amazing thing, how it tries to rewrite history. You're actually rewriting the neurological pathways of your brain. So she's trying to create a new deer path in the woods where the neurological pathway ends in someone saying, "I'm really sorry and I love you," or the fantasizer is trying to create a new neurological pathway where she says, "Yeah, that was good for me. It was my choice. It wasn't an assault," or "I got the person arrested," or whatever the end of the fantasy is. We are trying to heal our brains all the time. The important part for the therapist to confront is that they're actually doing it. You are actually doing it. You have control over this. This is a choice, even though it feels unconscious. Once they know and have conscious awareness that this is something that they are creating, now they have a new narrative. Because once they have the narrative, then they can grieve the relationship that they thought they have, and now they can create something new.
Right. Need to double back to second half of Tara's question was how to avoid colluding with the abuser by staying neutral.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's use this couple as an example. Like, this guy would say, well, she wants me to do it. She likes it. We both enjoy it. It's not like it's hurting her. Um, it's no big deal. We've always done it. All couples do it. And you don't want to align with the victim by saying, he's really hurting you. And you don't want to align with the abuser by saying, well, that makes sense. I get why you're trying to do that. And I get that you feel like you're helping her. The way to step away from that triangulation is to not have the superior position of, I know how I'm going to fix you, but are you noticing this pattern? What do you as the couple notice about the pattern? How is this working for you and how is this not working for you? So it's not that you necessarily want to stay neutral, but you want to have four legs of a table. And the fourth leg of the table is their own inner awareness. Like where is their inner therapist going to sit in the room? Like, how are they going to teach you about what they're doing so that it's no longer like a three-legged table, now it's a four-legged table. So what can you tell me about what's working about this and what isn't working about this? I don't want to hear that from the victim. I want to hear that from the quote unquote, abuser.
Yeah, that's good. Let's see. Next question is from Claudia. What are your thoughts about or experience with IFS and other forms of part work?
Well, that's a good question because I'm going to do a class with Frank Anderson on IFS and sex. So you'll get more of that if that's what you're looking for. I do IFS work, and that's part of internal family systems. That's part of the integrative relationship therapy approach, just like imago therapy. I'm an imago therapist as well. The idea in trauma work is that we have protector parts. We have smaller parts of us inside that are exiled, and we have protector parts. Like my protector part is a very independent part. Like, I'll take care of myself. She was developed very early on in life. Like, I got this. And it was almost like I told the little girl inside of me, I know no one's taking care of you. I'll take care of you. I got this. It's under control. And she's the protector part, right? So the exiled part is that little girl that's still sitting in the corner wishing someone would take care of her. And she sometimes sits on the couch and eats candy still. And so she needs the protector part to say, okay, Tammy, we're gonna make a nice dinner. I'm gonna make you a salad. I'm gonna take care of you. Like, that's how IFS would be used in situations around trauma. And a more dramatic example would be that, some people really do have parts that are not integrated at all, that may actually operate separately, like in dissociative identity disorder. But the parts of us that we all have are like the part that's showing up today for your class that asks the question is different than the part of you that's going to be home with your family. That's different than the part of you that's going to be out dancing at a club or at brunch with your friends or home eating candy in front of the TV. Like, we all have different parts. I think the short answer, because we're going to take a break in about 2 minutes, the short answer and the beneficial part that you can integrate today with your clients, if you have clients this afternoon, is to word things like, so a part of you likes to have sex this way with your partner because it makes you feel blah, blah, blah. A part of you enjoys feeling humiliated after sex. A part of you wants to rage at your partner because of the way they cut onions. A part of you doesn't feel safe in therapy. When you use that parts language, it relieves the person from feeling like, this is who I am. I'm trapped in this situation. This is all of me, and I have no other options. It relieves us from the burden of becoming our trauma, becoming our emotions. This is not who we are. This is something that was done to us. And we've developed different parts of ourselves in order to survive. So even if you can use that language with people, it can really help them to focus on the parts that are working and the parts that need healing. And again, this is a way to restore the power to them for their own inner healing, their inner wisdom. What parts of you can take care of that little girl? What parts of you can take on the healing in this relationship? It's an empowering language to use.
Okay, thank you for that. And as you mentioned, we are coming up on our first scheduled break. Number of questions still in the Q&A. I don't worry, we'll have more time for those later, but thank you, Tammy, for the response. It was really good. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. So let's take 15 minutes, and I'll see you back here soon.